Hi, Phil here. Just wanted to give you a heads up that in this episode, in describing one of the books, there are mentions of sensitive topics such as sexual abuse, violence, racism, and spiritual abuse. These begin around the 12-minute mark and go through the 16-minute mark. If for any reason you don't want these played out loud or listened to, please be advised. Thanks for tuning in, and now to the episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Three Books for Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Philip Schiavone with the Coalition for Christian Outreach, campus ministry, transforming college students to transform the world. I'm your co-host and producer, and your host with the most to say about books you should be reading, Byron Borger. Byron, how are you doing today?
Phil, I'm doing well here in central Pennsylvania. It's good to be with you again. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you too. And Byron, I am a storyteller at heart. You are as well in a lot of different ways. And today you've got some books about stories. Lead us right into it.
Okay, in our last book notes, and I'm sure many of your listeners to the podcast know we have this weekly newsletter that goes out, often quite large, listing books, new books, whatever, kind of like what we do here, except in written form. And the last book notes I did, just went out a couple of days ago, includes a handful of books about books. So they're books about why reading matters, what deep reading is. They're really nice. I think they're good. But then the heart of that book notes release, down at the bottom of that column, are two links. One is a link to a document I created listing about 75 of my favorite novels or short story collections, but mostly novels. And then the other link is about 75 memoirs, people's life stories, people narrating an episode from their life. So 75 novels, 75 memoirs, all of them really artfully written, creatively done to expand the imagination and the way we lean into life, what CCO would call a worldview, shaping the rhetoric and grammar of the texture of our days. So worldview is not just a bunch of ideas, creation, fall, redemption, or the lordship of Christ, or whatever. A worldview is more how you lean into life, the imagination you have about things. And I believe reading widely, even books that are not necessarily on the face of it religious or sometimes even irreligious, can help us understand life and how people narrate their lives and how to see things better. So reading novels and reading memoirs is a big strategy. I developed these lists actually for a group of pastors. I was doing a retreat, hours and hours of lectures and conversations together around books and reading and why preaching and pastoring can be enhanced by deepening your imagination as you read good literature. So anyway, I had these big old lists. They were handouts in this retreat I was doing, and I decided I'm going to share them in book notes. So of that book notes newsletter with those 75 lists of 75, I picked 3 books for our 3 Books for Hearts and Minds podcast. So I got 3 memoirs out of this bigger list. I'd like to share them for you today.
Sounds great. I'm excited to get those links in the description below. So if you're listening or you're watching, I will have those exact links to the websites, to the book notes, to those exact lists in the description below. And man, it would be fun to hear all 75, but I'm really glad you whittled it down to 3 for us. Why don't you lead us into the first one there, Byron?
Well, we got 3 books to talk about, and I'm going to start with the oldest of my 3, and it is actually, Phil, one of my all-time favorite books. You heard it right here, right now. This is a book in my top 10 ever, and I've been reading for a living, reading as a calling for 50 years, and our bookstore has been around over 40. So it's a big deal to say this. It's by a gentleman that passed away just recently. His name is Dennis Covington. And Dennis Covington wrote an award-winning book and won the American Book Award, the National Book Award a good number of years ago. It is called Salvation on Sand Mountain. This memoir, which is so well written by Dennis Covington, is set up like this. He was a war correspondent, so he thrives on kind of adrenaline. I used to correspond with him a little. Even his wife at the time asked me to pray for him. He just lives in danger. Okay, so he's a war correspondent. He's come back from El Salvador. He's working for the New York Times. And the New York Times finds out there's a murder trial going on. This is true. You can't make this stuff up. A murder trial going on in Appalachia where a snake handling pastor, this cult of people, it's illegal, but they handle rattlesnakes. And if they bite you and you have faith, allegedly, you live. And if you don't have faith, you die. So it's a really weird cultic thing. It's illegal, but there's these pockets of snake handling churches. There's this Pentecostal holiness snake handler guy whose wife was having an affair, and he holds illegal copperhead snakes, poison rattlers and stuff in his church. And so he sicks one of these snakes on her to kill her. But she lives and presses charges. So it is now a murder trial, and the Times sends him to Appalachia with this sort of smirking New York hillbillies down in Appalachia. What a weird story. Go down and cover that. Well, he goes down to Sand Mountain with an earnest openness to learn what this is really about. So for starters, he's not mocking Appalachians. Secondly, he's not mocking conservative religion, although it is pretty weird. And he gets fascinated with it. Adrenaline junkie that he is, you can see it coming a third of the way through the book. He wants to do this. These guys drink strychnine, and if they're in faith, they live, and if they're not, they die. They put their fingers in electrical sockets, and if they live, if they're in deep faith, they live, and if not, they get electrocuted.
So you're saying
with this, he's going to pick up the snakes. You see it coming.
He wants to be bit, is what you're saying. He wants to get bit by the snake.
He wants to not be bit. He wants the adrenaline charge of faith when you do something risky and live. Wow. I'll tell you this. I mean, I don't want to do spoiler alerts, but partway through the book, you realize he's become a Christian through these fundamentalists that are nutty as all get out. And they're both liberal, progressive New York Times writers. She's a novelist as well, feminist. They joined this Appalachian kind of cult, fundamentalist church of snake handlers. It is an unbelievable memoir. And he comes to his senses and realizes that there's something really wrong about the authority structures and the way all this stuff happens. Quite apart from the snake handling, even, there's other things in fundamentalist toxic religion that he's just not fallen for. But he's come to love these people. And you got to admire him that he cares for people that are so different than he is. Most of them are uneducated, they're rural, and they're fundamentalist. And he is, something other than that. And he grows to love these people and needs to break with them because he knows that they're on the off the charts deep end trouble. There's some other things that begins to go on as he studies his own religious roots, and this isn't too much of a spoiler alert, but it has to do with racism. It has to do with his past in the fundamentalist South, and it has to do with race and Martin Luther King and towns called Covington that he discovers, that's his own family name, who were slaveholders in the Deep South during the Civil War. And so as he picks up the snakes, it becomes a metaphor for the deepest evils in American culture. This is one heck of a book. The subtitle is Snake Handling and Redemption in Southern Appalachia. And you have never read anything as riveting. One reviewer called it flawless, as a book, seductive prose. It is a book of revelation. So yeah, there you go. Dennis Covington. And it's one of my favorite books ever.
That's a wild statement to have Byron Borger saying what one of his favorite books is ever. It's also, I think I've said this in a previous episode too. I think the best stories always come from curiosity and always come from the unexpected. And when you have a good storyteller that's also curious, that's also willing to be all in, those make for the best books, the best storytelling, the best documentaries. Like all of my favorites always have this sense of both curiosity, the unexpected, and then the personal, right? The personal where it's like, oh, I relate with both sides of this, right? Where we tend to be the good guy in our own heads, but when we can relate to both sides and create empathy with the curiosity, yeah, I think you got me, Byron. I'm getting ready to order that book right now.
It is an extraordinary read, but for the reasons you just said, Phil, that was nothing short of brilliant, which is why I'm so glad to push books, but let you do the reflection on what they all mean. Because what you just said was really, really important. That's a nice little article right there you could write up that is the best stories, the components of good stories, this curiosity and this imagination and being all in. I mean, that's Covington. His other books, we should do a book note sometimes just on him, because his other books were equally dangerous and equally, maybe not quite as weird, but they really were pretty daunting subjects. And he wrote a handful of books. I've read them all, but this is by far his most famous. And he just passed away a month ago, I heard on the internet, and sort of lost touch with him over the years, but he was a sort of an acquaintance and friend, and I'm glad to highlight that book. Can I tell you about another one that's also really, really good?
Please do, keep going.
This is one that is not old. This is almost brand new. It came out a month ago. And it, again, is just one of the books I could not put down. And to be quite honest, I didn't expect it to be so compelling. It's by a woman, and I got to tell you a little bit about her if you don't know who she is, Nancy French. The book is called Ghosted, An American Story. And Nancy French is a woman who is been on the politically active conservative movement in the last 10 years. Her husband, David French, returning veteran, right-wing scholar, writes for the National Review. She has been a ghostwriter, and so the phrase ghosted is sort of a double meaning here. A ghostwriter, of course, is when a professional writer writes a book for some celebrity who can't write, but has a story to tell. And I used to think it was a little kind of a cheesy thing to do, but actually it's people that have stories to tell that don't have the time or energy or skills to actually be a literate person. So they tell the story to somebody else. Well, she wrote, for instance, the biography of Sarah Palin. She's written with these right-wing political leaders and some other celebrities, the Bachelorette show and an Olympic athlete. So she's been writing as a ghostwriter for years, but particularly her passion was conservative politics of a thoughtful sort, conservative Republicans. It's not my politics, but I respect her. She began to see things come undone during the Trump years, and they became what is popularly known as Never Trumpers, which are conservatives in the National Review, kind of classic old school conservatives who thought Trump was simply not conservative. And so she would have voted for anybody else on the Republican ticket, but could not stomach working for Trump. And the hate mail began. She and her husband began to write articles about why Trump is not conservative. And the death threats started coming in. And the struggles in their family began. Part of her sub-story is she was raised really, really poor in Appalachia. They did not pick up snakes, but they might have. It was that kind of really rowdy, fundamentalist, deep, and alcoholic parents, part Native American, part hillbilly. She tells her early story, if you know J.D. Vance's Appalachian story himself, makes that look like Mayberry. I mean, she really grew up in the rough end of the tracks down in deep Appalachia. First woman to go to college, was sexually abused by her youth worker. That's not a spoiler alert because you learn it early in the book. And she was sexually abused, and this haunts her for much of her life, even though she covers it up for much of her life. A boyfriend in college attempted to murder her. She's had some incredibly dramatic stuff begin to happen, and yet she begins to follow Jesus in a meaningful way and falls in love with this Christian legal scholar, David French, who eventually, to serve his country, goes to Iraq. Comes back to a world in which they adopted an African child. And Phil, I had heard about this through Nancy's own tweets and Instagram account, but I had no idea how the alt-right that supports Trump has a strong, strong racist contingent. And the Proud Boys and these kind of folks began to send the most evil tweets out of pictures of her with animals like monkeys, of Black people with her face superimposed in, of her having sex with multiple partners. It's this kind of aggressive racism because they adopted a Black child. And so the death threats and the hatred and the pornographic videos that were sent nationally shamed them, but all the more caused them to fight back in a daring but deeply Christian, gentle way. So anyway, this is her story, Ghosted, about her Appalachian upbringing, her coming to faith, her beginning to expose sexual abuse in the church, her becoming sort of an expert in that, of coming to grips with her own persecution as people literally attacked them, unbelievably worse than I ever imagined. and then her becoming an expert in the trial against a well-known evangelical camp, one of the largest in the country, that was exposed for sexual abuse that they covered up, which you probably have heard about, and she became known. Curiously, people that went to that camp and supported it, friends are friends forever, Michael W. Smith wrote for that camp, said so much good has come out of it, we can't allow their reputation to be stained. And so the protection of an institution turned many people against her, even though she is documenting people that were hired by that camp that were known pedophiles. But yet, in the name of evangelicalism and focus on the family, and this guy's on Dobson's board, they dare not expose that. So, geesh, whether it's the Christian conservative evangelicals protecting sexual abuse, or whether it's Trump's people, they have been through hell and back over the last couple of years. And this is a memoir that describes that in brutal detail. So it's Ghosted by Nancy French. It is a book I could hardly put down. Russell Moore says it is a tour de force, the best memoir of the decade, he says. Interestingly enough, Mitt Romney has a blurb in the back. They were friends with the Romney family. There's also some funny stuff in this story, like when she couldn't bear to tell the Romney family that she didn't know how to ski because they assumed that everybody upper class skis and she was raised kind of poor and doesn't know how to ski. So she pretends to. Of course, he ran the Olympics in Utah years ago. And so he's got more ski equipment than you know at his Utah place, and took him out skiing, and she wrecks and almost dies and hits him, and they almost fall off a cliff. I mean, it is hilarious. And she's in tears, needing to confess to her friend Mitt Romney that, in fact, she doesn't know how to ski. And he takes care of her and teaches her at a safer slope. So there's also some good, funny stuff about this wonderful memoir called Ghosted.
Yeah, thanks for that, Byron. I want to say here that I would hope that beyond any political inclination you, the listener, might have, that you would understand that this is why we have books, because the news isn't going to cover things to this degree. And if they do, it's going to have one of the extreme biases, most likely. And so books like this help us, not necessarily help us choose a side or or choose politics. That's not necessarily the bent here that I know you have, Byron. It's more of this curiosity piece again. Are we willing to be curious? Are we willing to read widely? Are we willing to understand things from new perspectives? And from my own bent, younger and younger audiences have this curiosity more ingrained in them. It's more natural to them. And so if reading a book like this, if you're writing off reading this book for any reason, political or otherwise, I would encourage you to read this exact book, read a book like this, to connect to younger generations that hear stories like this and immediately are drawn to them, to find out more, to find out more beyond what the major news outlets are saying. This is more and more and more the ilk of Gen Z, even younger millennials. I think in some cases I'm an older millennial, but I know I'm Gen X. But Gen X and above, we've got this ingrained nature in us.
Yep.
I would encourage you to read this book to connect not only to the story, but to connect with the way that younger audiences are connecting to political things, to things that are controversial, to things that would often be listed under trigger warnings that you listed, and to be able to know more about some of these things that happen in our society. And it sounds like it's extremely well written as well. So I wanted to kind of have lend a quick pastoral note there to that book as well.
Thank you. Gretchen Carlson is a woman who, exposed Roger Ailes at Fox News, for the sexual abuse stuff. And she has a blurb in the back as well. So, those that are kind of in the conservative world would know many of the names that comes up in this book, and they admire the Frenches. Almost everybody admires them deeply for their conservative, patriotic roots, except the Proud Boys and the far alt-right. And so if nobody listening to this is part of all that KKK stuff. But for conservative folks, they know Nancy French, and they certainly know David French. And those that are not of that ilk, I mean, again, they are exposing some really hard stuff here. So no matter what your partisan position is, this is a memoir of betrayal and of faith and resilience and of hope and change. of addiction and abuse. I mean, there's a lot of hard stuff in here, but it's also a fun read. It's just a fascinating read. And I like the Frenches much more now than I ever could have imagined to, because I've entered some time into their world. So it's good stuff. The third one I want to tell you about is brand new. It comes out this very week here, May 29th, as we're filming this, Phil. It is a book that I got an advance copy of and I could not put down. It's not that long of a book, but I read it in 2 days. It is called The Understory. The Understory, the subtitle is An Invitation to Rootedness and Resilience from the Forest Floor. This woman, Laurie Ferguson Wilbert, has written 2 previous books. One was about curiosity, A Curious Faith, it was called, interestingly enough. She also wrote a book about touch, human touch, and the value of that. It won some awards a couple of years ago. This is a memoir of her moving to the Adirondacks, upstate New York, and living next to a river and spending a year or 2 loving her place. It's a lot of nature writing. It's particularly about trees. And it's particularly about how the trees and the stuff at the canopy at the top protects the junk at the bottom. And so you learn a lot about life by sort of excavating the forest floor. It is some natural history. It is some nature writing. It is some glorious stuff about canoeing and night kayaking and beavers attacking her lovely trees that she put up. She's really mad because these beavers chopped down these white birches that she's been watching in her yard for 3 or 4 years. And she's like, there's trees all over the place. Why did they have to go after mine? But, you know, they attack her, but she maybe thinks they're probably thinking the same thing about her. It's their territory too. So she's all about sort of letting your yard grow and let everything be where it's supposed to be. She's a nature lover. One person said that the review is like a combination, get this, of Wendell Berry, Madeleine L'Engle, and Eugene Peterson. And so it's 3 Christian writers, very different from each other, but Madeleine L'Engle is her favorite writer. She quotes Wendell Berry a lot, the land and the place. She's moved around a lot, so her sense of place is not what it ought to be. You know, she's not one of these people like Wendell Berry that puts down deep roots and has stayed there. She's moved 27 times in her life. She talks about her college years. She talks about her parents who get divorced. She talks also, Phil, about leaving a very toxic evangelical church whose friends now have turned on her over things like masking and vaccinations. She came to believe that you should wear masks, the church should be, but she says good people disagree about stuff, but geez, why do we like cut off each other's friendships over partisan politics? She's not a Trumper by any means, but her old church was. And so she went to seminary to figure out what she believes and why. So some of it is her kind of faith journey of deconstructing a pretty robust fundamentalism that she had. And I mean by robust, meaning strict. She was very much stuck in this strict kind of fundamentalism to a more elusive open faith shaped by the likes of Wendell Berry and Madeleine L'Engle. So anyway, this Understory is nature writing, it's memoir, it's her story. A fire breaks out in her house. She talks about her husband. She talks about her depression and going to a counselor. But lots of stuff about just living in the Adirondacks and learning to love her place as she goes hiking and canoeing amongst the trees, the beautiful trees in the Northeast. So anyway, I love this book. I couldn't put it down. Some of it made me cry. Some of it's kind of hard as she navigates her own depression and hard times, as she navigates her own leaving the social structures of her church behind and losing friends. At the end of the day, she says, other than her husband and her place, the one thing she has to cling on to is the person of Jesus, who she knows is alive in her life. And so maybe she says, maybe you've gotten there before I did. I'm a slow learner. But she says that ultimately Christianity is not a superstructure you have to hang on to, let alone an institution you have to support, but it is a person, and that person is Jesus. And that's what really you learned about this book most of all, is besides the beautiful nature writing, you learn to be rooted in the person of Jesus. So I love this book. It just came out. It's brand new. And I really, really hope some of our listeners will order it from us because it's a gem.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds great. The mix of the different flavors of authors that have an influence there, and a voice through her voice is really great. Byron, I worked in a greenhouse for a couple of summers, and it was actually the context of the summers leading up to my work with the CCO. And so when I went to new staff training and was learning about things like learning how God cares for creation and speaks through creation, I still had the greenhouse literally fresh in my mind from the week before of,
Wow.
oh yeah, there is so much in plants. There's so much in curating and creating gardens and God's garden in the wilderness that just speaks to us if we're willing, right? If we're willing to be
Yep.
curious, if we're willing to listen, but also have a sense of place. And that's something that I know campus ministers talk to with our students as well, is thinking through when you graduate from college and you go somewhere, that place matters, and thinking through what it means to be
Yep.
living in that place, serving God in that place, that's important. And so having that on a memoir angle as well for our students, for our staff, for our ministers and our lay people involved in churches,
Yep.
it's a topic we don't typically hear on a Sunday morning, and we need to. We need to be
Yep.
thinking
Yep.
about what it means to serve in Dallastown, in Shippensburg, in Pittsburgh, in Jamaica. My friend of a friend is in Jamaica now. I didn't know that. So whatever it is, we need this theology of place as well as this understanding of what it means to work out our faith in place. So any final comments on your end?
There's a beautiful episode in this where she's been hurt in a fire, and her neighbors start bringing her food. And she said, when I was part of a church, this food train thing was just a natural. Somebody's pregnant or somebody's in the hospital or something, the food would just show up. And she said, but I never experienced it from people that were not a part of a church. Her gay and lesbian friends, her guy with the Confederate flag that she sort of looks down on. Her neighbors cared for her. And there's something about a small town where the neighbors become a community as opposed to the church. Now, she's part of a church, and the church helped her out too. But her neighbors just showed up with pie and soup and friendly stuff. I mean, it's just a really touching episode of what it means to kind of be in a small town where people know your name, and you may not agree on stuff, but yet you become sort of friends because of your community and your care of the land and your sense of place. So that's a neat thing too. She talks about composting, and she said she's not very good at it, caring for land and so forth. An author she quotes a lot. Some of our listeners might know "Braiding Sweetgrass" by a Native American writer. Hugely important book over the last couple of years. "Braiding Sweetgrass." This is sort of like that again. So it's a book a lot of people that like good writing are really going to appreciate. 3 books from Hearts and Minds.
Thanks so much, Byron. And all of these books and the links to your book notes and more will be in the description. So feel free to check out the description below. Thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in once again. The order link will be the first thing in the description if you'd like to place an order for any of these books. And please feel free to share this podcast or this YouTube video and like it so that we can continue to share these books with more and more people. And you can also contact us. We'll have our email addresses. We'd love to hear not only your feedback on the podcast, but read these books. We would love to know what you think about these books and what other books come to your mind so we can continue to have listeners and Christians that are thinking widely, reading widely, thinking deeply about these things that matter to our faith and, of course, to the places that we live and serve in. So thanks again to you, our listener. Thank you, Byron. And this has been another episode of the 3 Books for Hearts and Mind podcast.